Well, I'm welcoming John Pilger right now, and I thank him for joining us. John, of course, needs really very little introduction. He's a great filmmaker and journalist, and it's an honor to talk to him. So, John, you just visited Julian Assange at the embassy. But first, before we get into that, how did you arrange that? Because my understanding has been that the Ecuadorian government cut off all visitors except his family and lawyers. And now we've had Stefania Morizzi of La Repubblica seeing him a couple of weeks ago. You went to see him, and now these German Bundestag members went yesterday. So tell us how you were able to arrange this before we talk about your meeting.
Well, there's been clearly a little loosening of the rules, not much. Those of us who are close friends of Julian have been allowed, but not many. Yesterday, I think it was a delegation from the Bundestag, German parliamentarians, went to see him. So why it's become suddenly a little more flexible, I'm not sure. It may have something to do with the fact that on the day I saw Julian, the new ambassador of Ecuador had just landed in London. Now, his mission is to resolve, quote unquote, the Julian Assange situation. So there's a great tension at the moment, a tension, an expectation. What does this mean? And Julian's family and friends are gathering around him as much as they can over the Christmas and New Year period, because there is a feeling that perhaps an expulsion is coming. We don't know. They may know more now, but if it comes, it will be sudden.
So, in a sense, it sounds ominous that they're allowing him his last visits with friends and finally around Christmas before they might actually move in, of course, with the British authorities, with the agreement of the Ecuadorian government. They can't enter without that. Now, when was the last time you saw Julian? And then what was your impression of him compared to the last time you saw him?
Well, the last time I saw Julian was perhaps 3 months ago, 3 or 4 months ago. Perhaps it's longer than that now. Yes, it would be longer. The restrictions were in place in March, so it is much longer than that, I'm afraid. It's over 6 months since I saw him. I have to say that he's in very good spirits. The extraordinary resilience of this man is something to behold. In his own personality, intellectually, he is Julian, and he and I went over many subjects, as we always do. His very dark sense of humor is intact. That hasn't changed. He looks very, very pale, very ashen. I'm not a doctor, Joe. I can't say exactly what Julian is feeling at the moment. His health is probably holding steady, but he urgently needs a comprehensive diagnostic work done. For many years, he had a cough which wouldn't go away. That has to be looked into. Having said all that, people should know that Julian's spirits, his whole sense of to hell with them, and his own resolve to stand up to those who would want to do a great injustice to him is undiminished.
He is as defiant as ever then that he's not leaving that embassy. He understands what's happening right now.
Yeah, he's not leaving.
Yeah.
I'll have to throw him out.
Yeah.
He's not going anywhere.
No, so he hasn't lost any of his intellectual edge, you're saying. How well informed is he about events in the world? Do his lawyers bring him newspapers? How does he keep in touch with what's going on?
He's in. I think in recent weeks he's become much better informed, and people who've come to him have clearly brought information to him. The wonderful world of WikiLeaks is that they know how to circumvent so many restrictions, so many limitations. And in some ways, Julian Assange, even in his isolation, has never been totally isolated. He has been in touch with people. That said, he said to me, there was one point where I wondered whether I really wanted, whether it was necessary to see other people. I started to get used to my own company. And then I realized this is the beginning of something that should not be allowed to progress. And so he was almost getting used to his own isolation. Now that's classically a prisoner accepting the restrictions of his deprivation, even of his sensory deprivation. So those symptoms were beginning to show. He recognized them immediately, and that's when his friends and lawyers and colleagues, I think, have come to see him. And he's alone part of the time, but people are coming to see him.
And he has some contact then through his lawyers, I suppose, with people running WikiLeaks right now. Does he have any kind of directions that he could still give? Does he have an active role in the work of WikiLeaks?
I don't think he has direct active role at the moment. He's left that to Christian, he appointed editor-in-chief and of WikiLeaks. So he doesn't have a direct role. No, there's too much else going on around his own situation. His threat is so ominous that clearly that consumes him.
Right.
I mean, what has been consuming in the past are the attacks on him. The Guardian's entirely fabricated story of Manafort and Russians visiting Julian. I personally can confirm that did not happen.
You clearly discussed that with him, then. You discussed the Luke
Yes,
Harding story.
Fabrication. It did not happen. It wasn't possible. The way the internal security works in that embassy, it was not possible. Anyway, it didn't happen. That story was a major fabrication by the Guardian. It can't be called anything else. Mm-hmm. It's a fiction. But the Guardian have been challenged over this, including by its former Guardian journalists. That questions have been sent to the editor-in-chief of the Guardian, Catherine Viner, asking her to explain, and only silence has come from the Guardian. Really is an indication of kind of degradation of the media today, and especially, I would say, of the once, quote, respectable, unquote, media. So we discussed that a great deal. Those attacks have come over the years, thick and fast. And for one man to cope with them is an extraordinary feat. I've watched Julian not quite absorb those attacks, but his first instinct is to analyze them, to expose their baselessness. He never, only occasionally does he express the anger. He does it, but to express the anger that any of us would feel of, say, an attack like the Guardian's utterly false story on Russians visiting him. I don't think Joe, I don't know about you, but I don't think in my career as a journalist, I don't think I've known a story that expresses so well the Cold War of today. It reminds me of what I grew up with. I grew up in the first Cold War as a child. I don't remember it quite being, of course, I was only a child, but I do remember my father being affected by it and being angered by it, but I've never known it to be as outrageous and as explicit as it is now. And that Guardian story, that fabricated Guardian story in attacking Julian, is an example of that.
I would add, and as little understood as it has ever been, because at least during the first Cold War, there was quite a awareness of what was happening, and there were diplomatic contacts between both sides. It was, in a way, less dangerous than today. And you're absolutely right. This story of Julian highlights, because it brings together the Russiagate saga and the issues of control of the media, and to the extent where the Guardian has, as you said, fabricated a story. They're supposed to be on the public side, and they're obviously on the side of the state, as anyone who does not support Julian is, on the side of the state against the people. Did you discuss with him any of the legal aspects of his case? I assume you did. Are you at liberty to talk a little bit about that?
The legal aspects of the case are, as you might imagine, incredibly complex on one side, but they're very simple on another. The simple side is that a way of getting Julian out of there, a way of getting the British government to honour its obligation to the United Nations Working Party panel, which, as you know, described Julian's situation in the embassy as unlawful detention and called on the British government to give him right of passage as well as compensation. Getting the British government to honour that obligation, as it does honour other United Nations obligations, is one of the main concentrations of his legal support at the moment. It's also thinking ahead, and when, rather I suppose than if, Julian is expelled from the embassy and he is arrested and he is taken to the senior magistrates court in London, where he will appear before a judge. In fact, she's the chief magistrate, a woman known as Lady Arbuthnot, whose own position is severely compromised. She is the wife of Lord Arbuthnot, who appears notoriously in WikiLeaks cables and is part of the arms national security establishment structure in this country. A great deal of discussion takes place about how to deal with that first court hearing. It will be effectively, I suppose, a bail hearing, because that's all. There are no charges against Julian. The one he's likely to be charged, I suppose, with infringing the terms of his bail. But in any other circumstances, the time he has spent in detention, in unlawful detention, as the UN calls it, would more than compensate the state, the Crown in this case, for this infringement. So there's a great deal of discussion among the lawyers of the tactics to deploy if and when that happens. And obviously I couldn't talk about them, but he has very good lawyers. He has his lawyer in London, his main lawyer, is Gareth Peirce, probably this country's greatest human rights lawyer, who has successfully defended those who've come up against the state in some of its draconian anti-terrorism laws, anti-refugee laws, and famously in the war with Northern Ireland. Gareth has been Julian's lawyer now I introduced them for about 8 or 9 years. He's in good hands there. There are many others who, Jen Robinson, who often is the person that does speak to the media and does it very eloquently and forcefully. She's been Julian's lawyer for even longer. So those people are ready and waiting for what might happen. What isn't there and what is needed, and that's why a vigil like this is so important, Joe, is the public. We talked about the differences between the First Cold War and the Second Cold War. I remember the First Cold War certainly by its opposition. In those days, there was opposition. Of course, then the unions were strong. And I'm talking about, I grew up in Australia, which mimicked much of the Cold War in the United States. But there was an opposition in those days. There isn't a popular opposition now. The so-called liberal opposition is so confused, so disorientated, and so almost wretched in its uncertainty, in its uncertainty of its true allegiances, in its collusion, that there simply isn't a major anti-war. That was, of course, Barack Obama's, in my view, Barack Obama's single achievement. He destroyed the anti-war movement by being there. They thought, oh, well, that's fine, we'll go home now. That's the difference. And what we need now, Julian, in many ways, Julian is a touchstone for opposition to so much of what is happening in our world. The rise of fascism in so many parts of the world, the threat of nuclear war. I think of all the cases that illustrate resistance to that, there's none like that of Julian Assange, and he needs popular support. He needs people to go into the street outside the embassy, to go in the street all over the world, as they've done in the past. He needs that popular support. In Australia, where I was recently, I read that one television survey, it was after an interview that Pamela Anderson gave on Australian television in support of Julian, and the survey showed that survey of something like 7,000 people, 92% of them supported Julian and wanted the Australian government to take diplomatic action to bring him home. That's a very high number. I believe that the great sleeper in many countries, I think in this country, in spite of an unrelenting and at times vicious media campaign against Julian Assange, in this country there still is a great deal of popular support. In the United States, I believe that's true. You would know that better than I, Joe, but it's that support needs to come out now. This is a critical time.
Well, John, I want to thank you very much for those words, and I hope they inspire people to do just that. And thank you again for joining us at the beginning of this vigil from London.
Thank you, Joe.
Bye-bye.